This week we're going to look at immigration in the United States in the early 2000s through the lens of ethnic prejudice, which seems to underlie much of the policies and concerns about immigration today. Inside the Statue of Liberty is a poem called The New Colossus, written by Emma Lazarus, which puts forth the philosophy that the United States has pursued for years in terms of immigration. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lip. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Today, this intent in this poem is apparently quite modified by the current administration. Ken Cuccinelli, the acting director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, in August of 2019 was giving an interview on National Public Radio and was questioned about the administration's policies restricting immigration, and Cuccinelli rephrased the Lazarus poem to state, "Give me your tired and your poor, who can stand on their own 2 feet and who will not become a public charge." Cuccinelli based this upon certain provisions in immigration acts in the past, and we'll take a brief look at some of those legislative actions. But certainly immigrations have been less than warmly received throughout our history, not just in the present time, and on many different occasions, as different waves of immigrants have arrived on our shores. Their acceptance is based upon the economic need of society, not so much their own need, as it is whether or not American society needs extra labor. And we ask ourselves the question as to whether America really is the melting pot that accepts persons seeking freedom from oppression around the world. Because our history doesn't always reflect that, and at times, such as the present day, it appears as though xenophobia seems to rule our thinking. The next several slides are going to look at some of the legislative acts that have occurred in our history regarding immigration, and to point just to some of the most important ones in this. The first immigration legislation was enacted in March of 1790, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which provided for any free white person of good character who had been living in the United States for 2 years or longer would be able to apply for citizenship. During the next few decades, in the early years of our nation, different waves of European immigrants began to arrive in America, including many Irish, many of whom were Catholic. About a third of immigrants coming to the United States in the first half of the 1800s were Irish, and another 5 million German immigrants also came to the United States during this period of time. The first anti-immigrant political party was created in 1849. It was called the American Party, but it was known as the Know-Nothing Party. And the reason for that was because members were told basically to deny any knowledge of the party if they were questioned. A backlash was developing in the United States during this time to the increasing number of German and Irish immigrants settling in the United States, partly because of the strong anti-Catholic sentiment which was developing during that period of time, and so the Know-Nothing Party was the political representation of that. And in fact, a former president, Millard Fillmore, ran as a Know-Nothing candidate for a second term of presidency sometime in the 1850s, as I recall, but wasn't elected. In 1882, the Chinese became the focus of concerns about immigration, and the Exclusion Act was passed barring Chinese immigrants from entering the United States. During the gold rush days, they were very welcome to the United States, and they provided labor in the gold mines and in the garment factories and were needed as the Transcontinental Railroad was being constructed. But once that was completed, it was no longer felt that their labor was necessary. In fact, concerns began to develop that they were taking jobs that Americans wanted. Although Chinese immigrants make up only 0.002% of the United States population at that time, white workers still blamed them for the low wages that existed on the West Coast. The Immigration Act of 1891 further excluded those who could enter the United States, barring the immigration of polygamists, people convicted of certain crimes, and the sick or diseased. The following year, Ellis Island, our first immigration station, was opened in the New York City harbor. And in the following 4 decades, more than 20 million immigrants arrived, mostly from Southern, Eastern, and Central Europe, although large amounts of Italians and Jews were also included in that group. In 1907, prejudices against Japanese again erupted on the West Coast as the white workers felt that they were losing jobs in their area and wages were falling in California, and the famous, or rather infamous, Gentleman's Agreement was signed that limited Japanese immigration to business and professional men only. In 1917, an Immigration Act established literacy requirements for immigrants entering the country and also at the time halted immigration almost entirely from Asian nations. The National Origins Act established nationality quotas in 1924 and restricted 2% of the total number of each nationality in the United States at the time of the 1890 census. This favored Northern European and Western European nations, and so immigration from other parts of Europe and from Asia were severely restricted as a result of this. There was concern about the Chinese and other Asian immigrants coming across the border in the south from Mexico, and so the border control was established to crack down on illegal immigrants crossing the Mexican and Canadian borders at that time. In 1942, with labor shortages during the World War II, the United States again began to encourage Mexican immigration, particularly agricultural workers, to enter the United States temporarily. This particular program lasted until 1964. Congress took action in the 1950s to end the exclusion of Asian immigration to the United States. And in the late 1950s and early 60s, the first wave of immigrants from Cuba began as they fled the island, as it was anticipated that a revolution was going to occur and the communists were going to take over the island. This was mostly professional and business owners at this time, but also about 14,000 unaccompanied children who came to the United States as a part of a secret anti-communist program called Operation Peter Pan. In the mid-1960s, during the Lyndon Johnson administration, the Immigration and Nationality Act overhauled the immigration system once again and ended national origin quotas, instead replacing it with a 7-category preference system that placed an emphasis upon family reunification and skilled immigration. During and after the Vietnam War, immigration from the war-torn regions of Southeast Asia more than quadrupled during this period of time, and family reunification became a primary goal during this immigration wave. In 1980, the Mariel boat lift occurred, where another wave of Cuban refugees arrived in the United States, those fleeing Castro's regime, crossing the Straits of Florida in overcrowded boats. In 1986, President Reagan granted amnesty to more than 3 million immigrants who were living illegally in the United States. During the Clinton administration in 1996, the Welfare Reform Act of 1996 barred most lawfully residing immigrants. Now, catch that. Most lawfully residing immigrants, those are green card holders, from receiving assistance under the Major Federal Benefits Program for 5 years in most cases. In 2012, President Obama initiated the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA Act, which temporarily shielded the young people known as dreamers from deportation. These are young people who were brought to the United States in undocumented status by their parents years before. But it did not provide a good permanent solution for this group of people. With the initiation of the Trump administration, new concerns about immigration have surfaced, to say the least. And in 2018, the Supreme Court upheld President Trump's travel ban that curtailed travel and immigration from many Middle Eastern nations and some South American nations, most of which had Muslim majorities in them. And in 2019, the Trump administration announced new regulations to deny permanent legal status, that is, green cards, to immigrants who are going to be likely to need government services such as Medicaid, public housing, and food stamps. That really is what prompted the quote by Cuccinelli that we mentioned earlier in this lecture. At the turn of the last century, immigrants were mistrusted also and were often blamed for the economic problems of the day. With the switch to an industrial economy that was occurring during this time, there were a lot of problems with urban growth and poverty and a high unemployment rate as individuals adjusted to the need to have new skills and to live new lifestyles as we transitioned from an agricultural society. The problems that resulted, which really tended to concentrate in immigrant populations, were often blamed on the immigrants themselves. The settlement house movement grew during this period of time because of the social needs of the immigrant population. And European immigrants were also thought to be interested in spreading socialism, and so it wasn't only economic concerns that Americans had, but also there were political concerns as well. Even though economics often lie behind the prejudice against immigrants throughout our history, since September 11th, we've seen fears that have been based on religion and political philosophies once again. In the article, Is This a White Country or What?, the author Rubin notes that white working-class persons are the ones who raise the question the most, as they're vulnerable to the economic contractions of society and see immigrants as competitors for jobs. It is the working class who tends to have the largest issue with immigration for that reason. These days, new immigrants to this nation tend to be of a different skin color, and so they're much more visible than the immigrants were 100 years ago or so, including many of the present-day Americans' own ancestors who arrived on these shores 100 years ago or so. So public discussion becomes cast in terms of race as much as immigration. The upper class is less apt to complain or feel threatened about immigration because they don't have a lot of contact with immigrants, but when they do, the population serves to supply a chief source of labor for their domestic help and for workers in their business. And this enables the upper class to keep wages lower, which of course only adds to the anxiety of the white working class in the process of doing so. Remember, the white working class is blaming the immigrant for this. This is saying it's really the upper class that's taking these steps. And the low-wage workforce helps to keep our economy competitive on a global basis, which is good for the upper class, but it decreases wages of working-class Americans in the process, and so sentiments about immigration are tied to the economy and how well it's doing as a result. There are some arguments put forth that immigrants have a higher degree of welfare participation, that it increases the longer that they stay in the United States. So immigrants are thought to be assimilating into the welfare system of the United States instead of the economy and our society. This is the result of the changes in immigration laws in the mid-60s during the Johnson administration, when family reunification became a primary reason for the acceptance of immigrants. Others will tell us that there's a consensus among social thinkers that the effects of immigration on employment prospect for citizens of America are modest and not a reason to restrict immigration, because immigration is concentrated in large population areas which are rapidly growing, and they're largely fitting into the new occupational slots that are created by this growth. Industries that might otherwise move offshore might be able to thrive locally because of immigrants, as some of those immigrants are willing to work longer hours and for lower wages than native-born Americans are. Immigrants fill jobs that native-born Americans are often reluctant to take, such as low-wage, back-breaking farm work, domestic work, and that type of thing. Employers prefer hiring illegals in some respects because they can be more easily exploited and are unlikely to file suit for unfair treatment or dangerous working conditions. They really are reluctant to speak up when they're put into bad situations in a work environment for fear of deportation. The Cato Institute published a study in 2018 which came up with some very interesting conclusions. Overall, immigrants are less likely to consume welfare benefits, and when they do, they generally consume a lower dollar value of benefits than native-born Americans. Immigrants who meet the eligibility thresholds of age for the entitlement programs or poverty for the mean-tested welfare programs generally have lower use rates and consume a lower dollar value relative to native-born Americans. The per capita cost of providing welfare to immigrants is substantially less than the per capita cost of providing welfare to native-born Americans. This is quite the opposite of what thinkers in the previous slide might have suggested. Contrary to what you'll hear oftentimes, and it's advanced even on websites that appear to be very legitimate, contrary to this belief, undocumented immigrants, including DACA holders, are not eligible to receive most federal benefits. This includes mean-tested benefits such as SNAP or food stamps, Medicaid, SSI, TANF, which is public assistance. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for health care subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, and are prohibited from purchasing unsubsidized health coverage on the ACA exchanges. Undocumented immigrants may be eligible for a handful of benefits that are deemed necessary to protect life or guarantee safety in dire situations like emergency Medicaid, access to treatment in hospital emergency rooms, access to health care and nutrition programs under the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program. Now, some states do choose to implement state-funded social service programs for undocumented immigrants to make up for the shortages and the denial of the federal programs. This is, though, an important factor for you to keep in mind because a lot of people think that undocumented, and you'll hear people saying that undocumented immigrants use a lot of federal benefits, and it's simply not true. Another question that's often posed is, why don't the Dreamers apply for U.S. citizenship? To apply for citizenship, you have to be able to be a legal permanent resident, that is, a green card holder for at least 5 years, and you had to have physically been present in the United States for the previous 30 months to the application. Getting the green card is the hardest part of the process, and it's one that keeps the vast majority of people really all over the world from becoming United States citizens legally. First, the person can be admitted as a refugee, and incidentally, refugees are eligible for some social services that undocumented immigrants are not eligible for. But a person can be admitted as a refugee or apply for asylum from their own country. An eligible employer can sponsor a person, this is a work visa, or a legally admitted close family member can seek permission to bring someone in. That's a family-based visa, and this is the most common method. Something less than 26,000 people are legally allowed to immigrate from Mexico to the United States each year, but there are 1.3 million Mexicans on the wait list. Almost all the Dreamers do not have a close family member who is a U.S. citizen who has permanent legal status, so it's impossible for them to obtain a green card. They have to have a close family member seek permission to have them brought in. A lot of times those individuals their parents don't have green cards. Since Congress has failed to pass any solution to this issue, the Dreamers can't pursue any of the legal paths to citizenship unless they were to return to their country of birth for a period of 10 years before being able to apply through one of the 3 avenues mentioned above. Different immigrant cultures integrate into the American way of life through different kinds of methods, and here's 3 theories that are suggested. First, assimilation, where new arrivals become absorbed into the dominant culture. Those enslaved and transported here who moved here after the initial English settlement, or in the case of Native Americans, as it says here, who were here already but were forced to lose power and autonomy, they're forced to disregard their own cultural traditions and adopt the values and norms of the dominant Anglo culture. And this assumes, of course, that in order to survive here, assimilation is necessary. A melting pot theory rejects the notion of European superiority and emphasizes the blending of all heritages, creating a culture that is uniquely American, so that in such a theory, no group makes its values dominant and everybody is equally American. And this is, I believe, what we call ourselves, the melting pot. And this is the idea that America is a melting pot, that really there isn't a dominant culture, but we know better. And in fact, assimilation is the method of immigration that is preferred in this nation. And then there's the multicultural theory, which has many sub-societies living together next to each other, combining their qualities, retaining some of their own customs and their own traditions, all accepted as valid, worthwhile, living together in equality with no dominant group. Many decry the devaluation of traditional American values in the process of integrating other cultural groups, that ethnic, racial, gender, and sexual preferences of other cultures distort American traditions. So there you can see the preference for assimilation rather than any of the other alternatives. The immigrant that you may encounter at work is adjusting to the challenge of living in an unfamiliar culture and loses a lot of what's familiar in the process. The degree of distance between his or her values and experiences and that of the host country is reflected in the sense of otherness and the oppression which results. Because they're not connected to the larger society, have poor familiarity with the system and its norms, and have limitations on their financial and social power, the outsider is often stigmatized and can be very easily exploited in the host country. And this vulnerability to exploitation is in direct proportion to the physical, linguistic, religious, cultural, and educational differences between the immigrant and the dominant culture. Particularly important is the immigrant's ability to speak the language of the host country. As has been mentioned in previous discussions, adult immigrants oftentimes are regressed to childhood because they don't understand the language, and at times they become dependent upon other people, sometimes their own children, in order to get along in society, and it becomes a very demoralizing, disempowering experience for them. So in working with the immigrant client, we must be sensitive to their vulnerability to all forms of oppression and the loss of their power. We should be open and respectful of the immigrant's sociocultural and spiritual background. We should not push the immigrant to adopt the new without integrating his or her own experiences and values, because otherwise we ask the client to deny his or her past self in order to conform, and that is oppression in its strongest form. We should never assume the client is ignorant or incompetent because they don't have mastery of the language or their skills aren't appreciated in the labor force here. We should not over-identify with our own culture. We should educate clients about their legal rights, about the services that are available to them, and about their social roles and what's acceptable conduct in the new culture. And when necessary and when possible, work with an interpreter, one that can ensure that the client understands what is being said and that you understand what the client is saying to you. The historian Erica Lee writes that beginning in 1882, the United States stopped being a nation of immigrants that welcomed foreigners without restrictions, borders, or gates. Instead, it became a new type of nation, a gatekeeping nation. The immigration restrictions announced by the Trump administration disproportionately penalizes immigrants from Mexico, Central America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Immigrants from Europe and Canada would be less affected. In fact, it's pretty clear that Trump has a preference for Northern European, parenthetically speaking, white immigrants. Cuccinelli, the acting director of Immigration Services that I've been mentioning in this discussion, later added, after he gave that first quote that I shared with you early in the talk, that in his opinion, Emma Lazarus' poem at the Statue of Liberty was really written to refer to people coming from Europe. An editor of the New Yorker magazine wrote in August of 2019, "The new regulation is part of a comprehensive effort by the Trump administration to restrict immigration, which includes steps to reduce refugee admissions, bar entry from certain Muslim-majority countries, deter asylum seekers, and apply greater scrutiny to all immigrant visa applications." Trump's diatribes have offered an unmistakably racist backdrop to these measures. He has railed against immigrants from shithole countries, characterized the influx of Latinos into the United States as an invasion, and suggested that 4 congresswomen of color should go back to the countries from which they came. This editor, Michael Lua, points out our history is marked with racist policies of nationality and immigration that focused previously on populations like the Irish and the Germans, the Catholics and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Jews and Italians and Southern and Eastern Europeans. But this does not mention the treatment even of Africans during the era of slavery, or the fact that natives were here and were abused during the Western expansion of our culture. The shame that we feel today, at least many of us feel today, in regards to how this administration is handling immigration and persons of different cultures and ethnicities, isn't a lot different from other periods of times in our history. And it's important that we be aware of that this is actually a part of American culture. We have to ask ourselves whether we want it to be this way. And we have to ask ourselves how we want history to judge the times that we live in. Thank you.